The pristine Boeing 787 sat grounded at LAX, its entire crew terminated within hours. Security footage showed a flight attendant's hand striking a passenger's face. What the airline executives didn't know yet was that the woman in seat 2A had just inherited the entire fleet. The reckoning was about to begin. Before we dive into this shocking story of discrimination and ultimate justice, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to smash that like button and hit subscribe with notifications on, because this story will blow your mind. Trust me, you won't believe what happens next when power meets prejudice at 30,000 feet. Let's get started. Dr. Amara Kingston stepped through the gleaming corridors of Los Angeles International Airport, her worn jeans and simple black sweater drawing curious glances from other travelers heading to Gate 47. At 35, she had built a tech empire worth billions, but today she looked like any other passenger rushing to catch the evening flight to New York. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner gleamed under the terminal lights, its silver body emblazoned with the elegant script of Celestial Airways. Known throughout the industry as America's premier airline, Celestial prided itself on luxury service and exclusive clientele. What most passengers didn't know was that the airline's founder had recently passed away, leaving behind a complex web of inheritance that would soon shake the aviation world. Amara clutched her business class boarding pass, purchased under her legal name rather than her business identity. 3 weeks ago, her grandmother Evelyn Kingston, the legendary civil rights lawyer, had died peacefully in her sleep. The funeral had been a who's who of legal and political figures, but it was the private reading of the will that had left Amara speechless. Among the properties, investments, and charitable foundations, there had been one cryptic line: "To my granddaughter, Amara, I leave the sky itself." The law firm handling the estate had been maddeningly vague about what this meant, promising full disclosure only after certain conditions were met. One of those conditions, apparently, was that Amara personally experience the current state of air travel in America. Hence today's flight, booked deliberately in business class to observe how the airline treated its paying customers. As passengers began boarding, Amara noticed the diverse mix of travelers. In first class, she spotted Richard Holbrook, a white businessman in his 50s whose expensive suit and gold watch screamed old money. She'd seen his type countless times in corporate boardrooms, men who wielded privilege like a weapon and never questioned their right to the best of everything. Behind her in the boarding line stood Moses Washington, an elderly black man in his 70s whose weathered hands and kind eyes told stories of a lifetime of hard work. He wore his best suit, carefully pressed but showing its age, and carried a small bouquet of flowers wrapped in clear plastic. When Amara smiled at him, he beamed back with genuine warmth. "Flying to see my granddaughter graduate medical school," he said proudly. "First doctor in our family, been saving for this trip for 2 years." Further back, Carmen Rodriguez juggled her squirming 18-month-old son while managing a diaper bag and carry-on. The young Latina woman looked exhausted but determined, her medical conference badge still clipped to her blazer from the pediatric symposium she'd attended in Los Angeles. The flight attendant managing the boarding process was Jessica Whitmore, a blonde woman in her late 20s whose perfectly applied makeup and crisp uniform couldn't hide the cold calculation in her blue eyes. She smiled brilliantly at the first class passengers, her voice dripping with practiced charm as she welcomed them aboard with champagne and warm towels. When Richard Holbrook presented his boarding pass, Jessica's eyes lit up with recognition. "Mr. Holbrook, so wonderful to have you flying with us again. Your usual seat in 1A is ready, and I've already chilled your preferred champagne." But as the line moved forward and passengers with darker skin approached, Amara noticed a subtle but distinct change in Jessica's demeanor. Her smile became tighter, her movements more abrupt, her tone shifting from welcoming to merely professional. Moses Washington handed over his economy boarding pass with a gentle smile. Jessica barely glanced at him, waving him toward the back of the plane with an impatient gesture. "Economy seating begins at row 15, she said curtly, already looking past him to the next passenger. When Amara stepped forward with her business class pass, Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. She studied the boarding pass longer than necessary, comparing the name to Amara's ID with exaggerated care. Dr. Kingston, Jessica read aloud, her tone suggesting skepticism. And this is definitely your ticket? Yes, of course, Amara replied calmly, though she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She'd faced this kind of questioning countless times in her career, the subtle implication that somehow she didn't belong in spaces reserved for success and wealth. Jessica held the boarding pass up to the light as if checking for forgeries, then handed it back with obvious reluctance. Business class is through that curtain. Try to keep noise to a minimum during the flight. As Amara made her way to her seat, she caught fragments of Jessica's conversation with the next passenger, a white woman with an economy ticket who received warm smiles and helpful directions to the overhead bins. The contrast was stark and deliberate. Captain James Mitchell's voice crackled over the intercom as passengers settled in. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Celestial Airways Flight 447 to New York's John F. Kennedy Airport. We're honored to serve you today and want to ensure every passenger enjoys our signature 5-star service. Amara buckled her seatbelt and pulled out her tablet, ostensibly to review work emails but actually to begin documenting what she was already recognizing as a pattern of discriminatory behavior. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Justice begins with bearing witness, child. You can't fight what you won't acknowledge exists. The engines hummed to life as Jessica moved through the cabin, performing final safety checks. When she reached Amara's section, she stopped and stared pointedly at the overhead bin where Amara had stored her carry-on. Ma'am, I need to verify that your bag is properly secured. Sometimes passengers don't understand our safety requirements. Without waiting for permission, Jessica opened the bin and roughly repositioned Amara's bag, making a show of pushing and shoving it as if it hadn't been perfectly placed initially. Other passengers watched the interaction with varying degrees of discomfort and curiosity. There, Jessica said loudly. Now it's safe for takeoff. As the plane taxied toward the runway, storm clouds gathered outside the windows, dark and ominous against the California sunset. Inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would soon expose the ugly truth about discrimination in the sky and lead to consequences no one could have anticipated. The Boeing 787 lifted off smoothly, carrying its passengers toward a night that would change everything. In seat 2A, Dr. Amara Kingston gazed out at the city lights below, unaware that she was about to inherit an airline and transform an entire industry. In the galley, Jessica Whitmore prepared for what she thought would be another routine flight of subtle prejudice and unchallenged privilege. Neither woman knew that before the plane touched down in New York. Everything they thought they understood about power and justice would be turned upside down. 20 minutes into the flight, the patterns of discrimination became impossible to ignore. Jessica moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, but her service revealed a stark disparity that made Amara's stomach turn with familiar anger. When Richard Holbrook pressed his call button, Jessica appeared instantly with a warm smile. "What can I get for you, Mr. Holbrook?" "I'd love another glass of that excellent champagne, and perhaps some of those macadamia nuts?" "Absolutely. And would you prefer the vintage Dom Perignon or shall I open the Cristal?" The contrast was jarring when Amara pressed her own call button 5 minutes later. Jessica took her time approaching, her expression already set in lines of barely concealed irritation. "Yes," she said curtly, not bothering with pleasantries. "Could I please have some water and review the dinner menu?" Jessica sighed audibly. "We're still setting up meal service. Water will have to wait until we reach cruising altitude." But even as she spoke, Amara could see Jessica delivering bottled Perrier in crystal glasses to first-class passengers who had made requests after hers. The discrimination wasn't subtle anymore. It was blatant and deliberate. 30 minutes later, when meal service finally began, the inequality reached new heights. Jessica wheeled the cart through business class, describing elaborate options to white passengers with enthusiasm that bordered on theatrical. "Tonight we have pan-seared Chilean sea bass with truffle risotto, or perhaps you'd prefer the Wagyu beef tenderloin with roasted vegetables and red wine reduction," she cooed to a middle-aged white couple across the aisle from Amara. When she reached Amara's seat, her tone flattened to bureaucratic indifference. "We have chicken or pasta." "I requested the vegetarian option when I booked," Amara said politely. It should be noted in my reservation. Jessica made a show of checking her tablet, shaking her head with exaggerated regret. I don't see any special meal requests. The chicken is our only option. But 20 minutes later, Amara watched Jessica serve an elaborate quinoa and roasted vegetable entree to the white passenger in seat 3C, complete with apologetic explanations about the mix-up that had nearly resulted in serving him regular fare instead of his requested vegan meal. The bathroom situation proved even more degrading. When Amara excused herself to use the restroom, Jessica intercepted her at the business class lavatory. "Excuse me, but this facility is temporarily out of order," Jessica lied smoothly. "You'll need to use the restrooms in the back." Amara glanced at the clearly functional bathroom, its vacant sign glowing green, but chose not to argue. She walked toward the economy section, passing Moses Washington, who offered her a sympathetic smile that suggested he'd witnessed similar treatment countless times. The economy restroom was cramped and less well-maintained, a deliberate humiliation designed to remind her of what Jessica considered her proper place. When Amara returned to her seat, she noticed Richard Holbrook emerging from the very bathroom she'd been told was broken. "Outstanding facilities in business class," he commented loudly to Jessica. "So much more civilized than flying commercial usually offers. We pride ourselves on maintaining the highest standards for our valued passengers," Jessica replied, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. The message was unmistakable. Amara was not considered a valued passenger, despite paying the same fare as everyone else in her section. Carmen Rodriguez's baby began crying as the plane hit mild turbulence, and Jessica's response revealed another layer of her discriminatory behavior. She stormed over to Carmen's economy seat, her face twisted with annoyance. "You need to control that child immediately," she demanded. "Other passengers are trying to rest." "I'm so sorry," Carmen whispered, trying to soothe her son. "He's just scared of the turbulence." "Well, figure it out. This is a premium airline, not a daycare center." But when a toddler in first class began having a meltdown 30 minutes later, Jessica's response was entirely different. She knelt beside the white family, offering toys, snacks, and understanding smiles while cooing about how travel can be so overwhelming for little ones. Moses Washington caught Amara's eye and shook his head sadly. "Been seeing this my whole life," he said quietly when Jessica was out of earshot. "Some things never change, no matter how high you climb or how much you achieve." As if summoned by his words, Jessica appeared beside Amara's seat with a plastic cup half filled with tap water. She set it down with unnecessary force, causing some to slosh onto Amara's tablet. "Your water," she announced. "Try to be more careful with electronics around beverages." The irony was breathtaking. Minutes earlier, she'd served Richard Holbrook wine in fine crystal stemware, personally steadying his tray table and offering a linen napkin to protect his expensive suit. Amara dried her tablet calmly, but her mind was racing. Every interaction, every slight, every deliberate act of discrimination was being cataloged and remembered. Her grandmother had taught her that power without purpose was meaningless, but power wielded for justice could move mountains. Jessica continued her rounds, offering premium amenities to white passengers while treating passengers of color with barely concealed contempt. She provided extra pillows and blankets to first class without being asked. But when Carmen requested a blanket for her shivering child, Jessica claimed they were reserved for premium cabin passengers only. The most egregious incident came when Amara's laptop charger stopped working. She politely approached Jessica, who was organizing magazines, in the galley. "Excuse me, do you have any charging stations or adapters available? My laptop battery is dying and I have important work to finish." Jessica looked her up and down with obvious skepticism. What kind of important work could you possibly be doing? The question hung in the air like a slap. Other passengers turned to stare, and Amara felt the familiar burn of humiliation mixed with rage. "I run a technology company," Amara said evenly. "I have presentations to prepare for tomorrow's meetings." Jessica laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Right. And I suppose you're a brain surgeon too," she turned away dismissively. "We don't provide technical support for personal devices." But even as she spoke, Richard Holbrook was calling out from first class. "Stewardess, could you help me with this laptop charger? I can't seem to get it working." Jessica practically sprinted to his aid, producing a universal adapter from seemingly nowhere and spending 10 minutes helping him troubleshoot his connection. Her patience was infinite, her service obsequious and eager to please. The contrast was so stark, so deliberately cruel, that other passengers began to notice. A young white businessman in the seat behind Amara leaned forward. "This is really messed up," he whispered. "I've been watching what she's doing to you. It's completely wrong." But sympathy wasn't action, and Jessica's behavior only escalated as the flight continued. She made announcements about maintaining appropriate behavior and respecting other passengers, while staring directly at Amara, as if her mere presence was disruptive. When Amara's phone rang with an urgent call from her assistant about her grandmother's estate, Jessica materialized beside her seat with frightening speed. "All electronic devices must be turned off during flight operations," she snapped, though passengers throughout the cabin were openly using phones and tablets. "This is an important business call," Amara explained. "I'll only be a moment." "Hang up immediately, or I'll have you arrested for violating federal aviation regulations." The threat was absurd and legally baseless, but it served its purpose. Other passengers stared as Jessica stood over Amara like a prison guard, her hand dramatically positioned near the call button that would summon the captain. Amara ended the call, but not before catching fragments that would prove prophetic. "At your grandmother's final instructions," and "complete ownership transfer," and "the sky itself means." Jessica's ears perked up at the mention of ownership and business dealings, but her expression remained skeptical and mocking. In her worldview, successful black women were anomalies to be questioned, not realities to be respected. As the plane flew through the night sky, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly tense. Jessica's discrimination had moved beyond microaggressions into outright hostility, while Amara maintained her dignity with superhuman composure. What Jessica didn't know was that every slight, every insult, every act of deliberate prejudice was being observed and remembered not just by the victim, but by the future owner of the airline itself. The reckoning was coming, and it would be more devastating than anything she could imagine. The storm clouds that had gathered over Los Angeles were nothing compared to the tempest about to break over Celestial Airways. In Seat 2A, Dr. Amara Kingston prepared for a confrontation that would change everything, while Jessica Whitmore walked blindly toward the destruction of her career and the exposure of an entire system built on discrimination and hate. As the plane cruised through the dark sky over Nevada, turbulence began to rock the aircraft. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. "Folks, we're experiencing some rough air tonight. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we navigate through this weather system." But for Jessica Whitmore, the physical turbulence was nothing compared to the storm of rage building inside her as she watched Amara Kingston maintain her composure despite hours of deliberate mistreatment. Something about the black woman's quiet dignity infuriated Jessica beyond reason. As the plane bounced through another air pocket, Jessica grabbed the intercom microphone and made an announcement that chilled passengers to the bone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing unusual turbulence tonight. Sometimes negative energy from disruptive passengers can affect the aircraft's stability. Please remain calm while we address any behavioral issues." Her eyes locked on Amara as she spoke, the message unmistakable to everyone in the cabin. Blaming turbulence on a passenger's negative energy was not only absurd, but revealed the depth of Jessica's discriminatory delusions. Richard Holbrook seized the moment to insert himself into the drama. "Stewardess," he called out loudly, "I think we all know where the problem is coming from. Some people just don't understand how to behave in civilized society." His words carried clearly through the cabin, and several passengers shifted uncomfortably. Carmen Rodriguez looked up from soothing her baby, her medical training making her acutely aware of the psychological abuse she was witnessing. Moses Washington had seen enough. The elderly man unbuckled his seatbelt and stood slowly, his weathered hands gripping the seat back for support as the plane continued to shake. "Young lady," he said to Jessica, his voice carrying the authority of 7 decades of hard-won wisdom. "I've been flying for 50 years, and I've never seen a flight attendant treat a paying passenger with such disrespect. This woman has done nothing wrong. Jessica's face flushed red with anger. Sir, I need you to sit down immediately and mind your own business. You people always stick together, don't you? The phrase, you people, echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Even passengers who had been trying to ignore the situation could no longer pretend they hadn't heard blatant racism. Carmen couldn't stay silent anymore. As a pediatrician, she'd taken an oath to protect the vulnerable, and she recognized psychological abuse when she saw it. This is completely unacceptable, she said firmly. You're creating a hostile environment for multiple passengers based on their race. Jessica whirled on her with vicious intensity. And you need to control that screaming brat before I have security waiting at the gate to arrest you for child endangerment. The threat was so outrageous that several passengers gasped audibly. Threatening to have a doctor arrested for child endangerment because her baby was crying during turbulence revealed Jessica's complete disconnection from reality and professional standards. Amara remained seated throughout the escalating confrontation, but she pulled out her business card and placed it on her tray table. The simple white card read, Dr. Amara Kingston, CEO, Kingston Technologies. Perhaps this will clarify any confusion, she said quietly, offering the card to Jessica. Jessica snatched it and examined it with exaggerated skepticism. Anyone can print fake business cards, she announced loudly. I've seen this scam before. People pretending to be successful to get special treatment. She actually crumpled the business card and dropped it on the floor, grinding it under her heel in a gesture so deliberately disrespectful that passengers throughout the cabin began reaching for their phones to record the unfolding disaster. Richard Holbrook stood up, emboldened by Jessica's escalating aggression. This is exactly what I'm talking about. These people always claim to be something they're not. Look at her clothes. Does that look like a CEO to you? His gesture toward Amara's casual attire drew murmurs of disapproval from other passengers who recognized the ugly prejudice on display. Success and wealth didn't require designer labels, and judging someone's worth by their appearance was the kind of thinking that belonged in history books, not modern aircraft. But Jessica was beyond reason now, feeding off Richard's encouragement and her own twisted sense of superiority. She keyed the intercom again, her voice shaking with rage. Attention passengers, we have individuals on board who are disrupting the flight with false claims and aggressive behavior. Please remain calm while we handle this security situation. The announcement was a complete fabrication. Amara hadn't been aggressive, Moses had simply defended another passenger, and Carmen had stated medical facts. But Jessica was creating her own narrative, one where she was the victim, and the passengers of color were the aggressors. Captain Mitchell's voice cut through the tension. Flight Attendant Whitmore, please report to the cockpit immediately for consultation. Jessica ignored the direct order from her captain, too consumed with her confrontation to recognize the gravity of her insubordination. Instead, she approached Amara's seat with predatory intensity. Now, I need to pause here and ask you something important. Comment number 1 if you've ever witnessed this kind of blatant discrimination in person, or comment number 2 if this is the first time you're seeing racism this obvious. Don't forget to smash that like button if you're feeling the same anger and frustration that Moses and Carmen are experiencing right now, and hit subscribe because what happens next will shock you to your core. But here's the question that's burning in everyone's mind. How much more can Dr. Amara Kingston take before she reveals who she really is? And when Jessica finally crosses that final line, what kind of consequences will she face? The answer is coming up, and it's more explosive than anything you could imagine. You think you're so smart, don't you? Jessica hissed, leaning over Amara's seat. Playing dress-up, pretending to be important. Well, this is my airplane, and I decide who belongs here. Amara looked up calmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Your airplane? The question was simple, but something in Amara's tone made Jessica pause. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across the flight attendant's face. But Richard Holbrook's encouraging nods from across the aisle emboldened her to continue. That's right. I represent Celestial Airways on this aircraft, which makes me the authority here. And I'm telling you that your behavior is unacceptable. Moses Washington laughed, the sound bitter with decades of experience. Child, you don't represent anything but ignorance and hate. I've seen your kind before, hiding behind uniforms and titles while treating people like dirt." "How dare you!" Jessica shrieked. "Security will be waiting for both of you when we land. I'm filing reports." For passenger interference with crew operations, Carmen stood up, her medical credentials giving her confidence to challenge Jessica's authority. "I'm a physician, and I'm witnessing psychological abuse and racial discrimination. This behavior violates federal aviation regulations and basics, human decency." "Oh, another fake professional," Jessica laughed maniacally. "Let me guess, you're a brain surgeon too? You people and your delusions of grandeur." The phrase "you people" again, this time directed at a respected pediatrician whose medical conference badge was clearly visible on her blazer. Jessica's racism had stripped away all pretense of professionalism. Amara's phone buzzed with another urgent call. The caller ID showed Celestial Airways Legal Department, and she knew this call would change everything. But as she reached for the phone, Jessica's hand shot out to stop her. "I told you, no phone calls during flight operations." "This is from Celestial Airways Legal Department," Amara said quietly. "Perhaps you should let me answer it." Jessica's eyes widened with confusion and suspicion. "Why would our legal department be calling you?" Before Amara could respond, her phone rang again. This time she answered despite Jessica's protests, putting the call on speaker so everyone could hear. "Dr. Kingston, this is Margaret Chen from Celestial Airways Legal. We have urgent news about your inheritance. The final paperwork has been processed, and we can now confirm that you own 60% controlling interest in Celestial Airways, making you the majority owner of the entire fleet." The cabin fell silent except for the drone of engines and the whistle of wind outside. Jessica's face went through a rapid sequence of emotions: confusion, disbelief, terror, and finally, desperate denial. "That's impossible," she whispered. "This is some kind of scam." But Moses Washington was laughing again, this time with pure joy. "Child," he said to Jessica, "you just spent the last 2 hours abusing the woman who owns this airplane, the woman who signs your paychecks, the woman who can fire every single person who works for this airline." Carmen was recording everything on her phone, her medical training making her acutely aware that she was documenting a historic moment of justice. "This is incredible," she breathed. "You literally told her it was your airplane." Richard Holbrook had gone pale, realizing that his encouragement of Jessica's racist behavior had been captured on multiple phones and witnessed by dozens of passengers. His attempts to distance himself from the situation were pathetic and transparent. "Now wait just a minute," he stammered. "I never said anything inappropriate. I was just trying to support the crew." But the recordings would tell a different story, and everyone knew it. Jessica stood frozen in the aisle, her world crumbling around her as the magnitude of her mistake became clear. She had just systematically abused, discriminated against, and threatened the owner of the airline. Her career wasn't just over, it was destroyed so completely that she would never work in aviation again. The turbulence outside had calmed, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was just beginning. Dr. Amara Kingston, the quiet woman in seat 2A, was about to reveal the full extent of her power, and the consequences would reshape an entire industry. As passengers whispered and recorded, as Jessica stood paralyzed with shock, and as the plane continued its journey through the night sky, everyone realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The moment when justice caught up with discrimination at 30,000 feet. The reckoning had begun. The silence following the legal department's call stretched for nearly 30 seconds, broken only by the steady hum of the engines and Jessica's rapid breathing. Her face had gone from flushed red to pale white as the reality of her situation sank in. Richard Holbrook was the first to break the stunned quiet, his voice cracking with panic. "There must be some mistake. This is clearly a fraud attempt. Nobody just inherits an airline." But Amara was already pulling additional documentation from her briefcase, documents that had been prepared by her grandmother's legal team weeks ago. The inheritance was complex, involving trust funds, stock transfers, and carefully planned acquisitions that had taken years to arrange. "My grandmother Evelyn Kingston was not just a civil rights lawyer," Amara said calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. She was also a shrewd investor who spent 40 years quietly purchasing shares in companies where she witnessed discrimination. Celestial Airways was her largest holding. Moses Washington slapped his knee with delight. Evelyn Kingston. I remember her from the civil rights movement. That woman was a force of nature. She always said she'd change the world one lawsuit at a time. Jessica's mind raced through the implications. Every insult, every discriminatory act, every moment of deliberate cruelty had been witnessed and experienced by the person who could end her career with a single phone call. But instead of apologizing or backing down, her panic manifested as increased aggression. "I don't care who you claim to be," she shouted, her voice shrill with desperation. "You don't belong in business class, and you've been nothing but trouble. Since boarding, your behavior has been completely inappropriate." Carmen couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Are you serious right now? After everything we just learned, you're still doubling down on your racism?" "This isn't about race," Jessica screamed, completely losing control. "This is about respect and knowing your place in society." The phrase "knowing your place" hung in the air like poison gas. Every passenger in the cabin understood exactly what Jessica meant, and the recordings captured every ugly word. Moses Washington stood up again, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. "Young woman, I lived through segregation, Jim Crow laws, and decades of people like you telling me to know my place. I thought we'd moved beyond this kind of hatred." "Well, maybe some lessons need to be relearned," Jessica snarled back, abandoning all pretense of professionalism. Captain Mitchell's voice boomed over the intercom. "Flight Attendant Whitmore, return to the galley immediately. This behavior is completely unacceptable and violates every standard of conduct." But Jessica was beyond listening to authority. Her world was collapsing and she was determined to take everyone down with her. She turned back to Amara with venomous intensity. "You think owning some stock makes you special? You think money changes what you are? This is America, and people like you need to remember your place." She took a step closer to Amara's seat, her hand raised in a threatening gesture. "I don't care if you own the whole airline. You're still just another uppity girl who needs to be put in her place." The racial slur was delivered with such venom that several passengers gasped audibly. Carmen immediately started recording, knowing she was documenting something that would become evidence in multiple lawsuits. Amara stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. At 5 feet 8 inches, she was slightly taller than Jessica, but her presence filled the entire cabin. Years of boardroom negotiations and hostile takeovers had taught her how to project authority without raising her voice. "I think," she said quietly, "it's time for you to understand exactly who you're talking to." Jessica's response was swift and shocking. Her hand shot out and struck Amara across the face with a resounding slap that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. The assault was so sudden, so unprovoked, and so completely captured on multiple phones that the entire cabin erupted in chaos. Passengers shouted in outrage, phones appeared everywhere to record the aftermath, and Moses Washington immediately called the Federal Aviation Authority's emergency hotline. Amara touched her cheek where Jessica's hand had left a red mark, her expression remaining calm despite the assault. When she spoke, her voice was deadly quiet. "Did you just assault the owner of this airline?" Jessica realized what she had done, but instead of apologizing, she doubled down with the desperation of someone whose career and reputation were already destroyed. "You deserved it. You've been causing trouble all flight, disrupting other passengers, making false claims about ownership. Sometimes people need to be reminded of reality." Carmen was already on her feet, her medical training kicking in. "I need to examine that injury. As a physician, I'm required to document any assault I witness." "She's fine," Jessica shouted. "Stop making this into something it's not." But Richard Holbrook, realizing he needed to distance himself from the disaster, suddenly switched sides, with transparent opportunism. "I think everyone can see that the flight attendant is completely out of line. This is shocking behavior from airline staff." His attempt to rewrite history was pathetic, especially since his earlier encouragement of Jessica's racism had been recorded by multiple passengers. Moses Washington looked at him with disgust. "You've got some nerve, son. 5 minutes ago you were cheering her on, and now you want to pretend you're innocent?" Captain Mitchell's voice cut through the chaos. "This is your captain speaking. Due to an incident in the cabin, I am making an emergency notification to ground control. Law enforcement will meet this aircraft upon arrival." Jessica's face went white as the reality hit her. She had just committed assault on a commercial aircraft in front of dozens of witnesses against the owner of the airline. Federal charges were inevitable. Her career was over, and her actions had been recorded by multiple passengers for the world to see. But the worst was yet to come. Amara pulled out her phone and made a call that would send shockwaves through the aviation industry. "This is Dr. Amara Kingston, majority owner of Celestial Airways. I need to speak with the CEO immediately about an emergency situation involving employee misconduct and assault." As she spoke, Jessica stood frozen in the aisle, finally understanding the magnitude of her mistake. She had systematically abused, discriminated against, and finally assaulted the one person who had the power to destroy not just her career, but the careers of everyone who had enabled or ignored her behavior. The other passengers watched in stunned fascination as justice began to unfold at 30,000 feet. Carmen continued documenting Amara's injuries while Moses Washington provided witness statements to federal authorities over the phone. Richard Holbrook sat in his first-class seat, desperately trying to delete the recordings he had made earlier, but other passengers had already captured his discriminatory comments and enthusiastic support of Jessica's racist behavior. As the EC plane continued toward New York, everyone aboard realized they were witnessing history, the moment when decades of systematic discrimination in the airline industry finally met consequences that would reshape everything. Jessica Whitmore had picked the wrong woman to abuse. She had assaulted the owner of the airline, and the reckoning was just beginning. The flight that was supposed to end her shift had instead ended her career, her reputation, and possibly her freedom. And in Seat 2A, Dr. Amara Kingston prepared to transform an entire industry through the power of justice and accountability. The storm outside had calmed, but the tempest inside the cabin was just reaching its peak. The assault had lasted only seconds, but its reverberations would echo through the aviation industry for years to come. As Amara touched her reddened cheek, the cabin erupted into organized chaos that would have made her grandmother proud. Captain Mitchell emerged from the cockpit, his face grim with the kind of anger that comes from witnessing the complete breakdown of professional standards under his command. He had been flying for 27 years and had never seen a flight attendant assault a passenger, let alone the owner of the airline. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 4 military stripes, "you are immediately suspended from all duties. Return to the galley and remain there until we land." Jessica's response revealed the depth of her delusion. "Captain, this passenger has been disruptive all flight. She's making false claims about owning the airline, threatening crew members, and disturbing other travelers. I was defending myself and maintaining order." The lies were so blatant, so easily disproven by dozens of witnesses and multiple recordings, that several passengers laughed out loud at her audacity. Moses Washington had his phone pressed to his ear, speaking with an FAA incident coordinator. "Yes, ma'am, I witnessed the entire assault. The flight attendant struck a passenger without provocation after hours of racial discrimination. Multiple passengers have video evidence." Carmen was kneeling beside Amara's seat, her medical training evident as she gently examined the red handprint on Amara's cheek. "There's definite soft tissue trauma consistent with an open-hand strike. The mark will be visible for several days. I'm documenting this as assault with photographic evidence." "Don't touch her!" Jessica shrieked, completely abandoning any pretense of sanity. "She's probably going to claim fake injuries for a lawsuit." Captain Mitchell's patience evaporated. "Ms. Whitmore, if you do not return to the galley immediately, I will have you physically restrained for the remainder of this flight." But Jessica was beyond reason, her career crashing around her like a demolished building. She turned back to the passengers, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "You're all falling for this scam. People like her always play the victim. Always. Claim discrimination when they don't get special treatment. I've been a flight attendant for 8 years and I know troublemakers when I see them." Richard Holbrook, realizing his earlier support of Jessica's behavior had been recorded by multiple phones, attempted a pathetic reversal. Captain, I think we can all agree that this situation has gotten completely out of hand. As a frequent flyer, I've never seen such unprofessional conduct from airline staff. Moses Washington pointed an accusing finger at him. Don't you dare try to rewrite history, boy. We all heard you encouraging her racism, cheering her on when she was abusing this woman. I was doing no such thing, Richard protested, but his denials were met with scoffs from passengers who had witnessed his earlier behavior. Carmen looked up from her medical examination. I have clear photographs of the assault injuries, and my phone recorded the actual impact. This is going to be evidence in federal court. As if summoned by her words, Amara's phone rang again. This time the caller was William Sterling, CEO of Celestial Airways, and she put the call on speaker for everyone to hear. Dr. Kingston, I just received word about an incident aboard Flight 447. I want to assure you that Celestial Airways takes any allegations of employee misconduct extremely seriously. Jessica's face went white as she heard her CEO speaking directly to the woman she had spent hours abusing. Mr. Sterling, this is Flight Attendant Whitmore. There's been a misunderstanding. This passenger has been disruptive and… Ms. Whitmore, Sterling's voice cut through her explanation like a sword. You are hereby terminated from Celestial Airways effective immediately. Security will escort you from the aircraft upon landing, and you are banned from all company property permanently. The termination was swift, decisive, and broadcast to the entire cabin. Jessica stood in the aisle, her uniform suddenly feeling like a costume from a play she was no longer allowed to perform. You can't fire me, she screamed. I have rights. I was defending the airline's reputation. You assaulted the majority owner of this company, Sterling's voice continued through the speaker. Your employment contract is voided due to criminal behavior, and the company will cooperate fully with federal prosecutors. Carmen stood up, brushing off her knees. As a medical professional, I'm required to report this assault to authorities. Dr. Kingston, do you want to press charges? The question hung in the air as everyone waited for Amara's response. She looked around the cabin, seeing Moses Washington's encouraging nod, Carmen's supportive smile, and even some apologetic glances from passengers who had remained silent during Jessica's discriminatory behavior. Yes, she said simply. Federal charges for assault on an aircraft, and I'll be filing civil rights violations with the Department of Transportation. Jessica's legs buckled, and she grabbed a seat back for support. Federal charges meant prison time, permanent criminal record, and the end of any hope for future employment in aviation. Her 8-year career had been destroyed in a single moment of racist violence, but the consequences were just beginning. Sterling's voice continued through the phone. Dr. Kingston, I want to personally apologize for this incident. We're conducting an immediate investigation into how this employee's discriminatory behavior went unchecked. Oh, it didn't go unchecked, Moses Washington called out. We all saw her supervisor encouraging her racism, praising her for maintaining standards while she abused passengers. Richard Holbrook realized he was being implicated and started sputtering denials, but his earlier recorded comments would speak louder than his current protests. Captain Mitchell addressed the cabin through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Celestial Airways, I want to apologize for the completely unacceptable behavior you've witnessed tonight. An incident report is being filed with federal authorities, and law enforcement will meet this aircraft upon arrival. Jessica made one final desperate attempt to salvage her situation. This is all a setup. She probably planned this whole thing, flying on her own airline just to cause trouble. The accusation was so absurd that even she seemed to realize how ridiculous it sounded. Carmen shook her head in disbelief. You assaulted a passenger who was quietly reading a book. There's no setup here except your own prejudice and hatred. As the plane began its descent toward JFK, the mood in the cabin was a mixture of justice, satisfaction, and anticipation. Passengers were already uploading videos to social media, and the story was beginning to spread across the internet like wildfire. Moses Washington smiled at Amara with grandfatherly pride. Your grandmother would be so proud of how you handled this. Grace under pressure, strength in the face of hatred. Carmen nodded in agreement. You've probably changed the aviation industry forever. This is going to force every airline to examine their discrimination policies. But Jessica wasn't finished. In a final display of the racism that had destroyed her career, she pointed at Amara and screamed, "This isn't over. People like you always think you've won, but you don't belong in first-class anything." The words would be her last as a Celestial Airways employee, preserved forever on multiple recordings that would serve as evidence in federal court. She had managed to make her situation even worse with a final burst of documented racism. As the lights of New York appeared below, Dr. Amara Kingston looked out the window and thought about her grandmother's words. Justice delayed is not justice denied when courage meets opportunity. Tonight, courage had met opportunity at 30,000 feet, and the aviation industry would never be the same. The Boeing 787 touched down at JFK International Airport with unusual precision, as if Captain Mitchell was eager to end the nightmare flight that had destroyed careers and expose the ugly truth about discrimination in American aviation. As the plane taxied toward the gate, passengers could see the unusual activity waiting for them. Security vehicles, airline executives, and what appeared to be federal law enforcement officers positioned near the jetway. Jessica Whitmore sat in the galley under the watchful eye of the senior flight attendant, her face a mask of desperate denial mixed with dawning terror. The reality of federal assault charges was beginning to penetrate her racist delusions, and she alternated between claiming victimhood and making increasingly frantic attempts to justify her behavior. "This is all being blown out of proportion," she whispered to anyone who would listen. "I was just maintaining order. Passengers like her always cause trouble, and someone has to enforce standards." Even in the face of criminal charges, she couldn't stop revealing the depth of her prejudice. Every word she spoke was being recorded by passengers who understood they were documenting historic evidence of systematic discrimination. As the plane reached the gate, Captain Mitchell's voice filled the cabin one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until law enforcement and airline officials board the aircraft. Thank you for your patience during this unprecedented situation." The jetway door opened to reveal a small army of officials, FBI agents specializing in aviation crimes, TSA security supervisors, Port Authority police, and 3 executives from Celestial Airways corporate headquarters streamed onto the plane with grim efficiency. The lead FBI agent, a sharp-faced woman named Sarah Chen, approached Amara's seat with professional courtesy. "Dr. Kingston, I'm Special Agent Chen with the FBI's Aviation Crime Unit. We'd like to take your statement about the alleged assault and any other incidents during this flight." Jessica watched in horror as federal agents treated her victim like the respected business leader she actually was. The cognitive dissonance was almost too much for her racist worldview to process. Meanwhile, Moses Washington was surrounded by officials eager to hear his eyewitness account. As a veteran civil rights activist and grandfather of the first black female doctor in his family, his testimony carried tremendous weight with investigators. "I've seen discrimination my whole life," he told Agent Chen. "But this was the most blatant, systematic abuse I've ever witnessed on commercial transportation. That flight attendant created a hostile environment based purely on racial prejudice." Carmen Rodriguez had assembled a complete medical file documenting Amara's injuries, complete with photographs, timestamps, and professional observations about the assault. Her credentials as a pediatrician lent credibility to her documentation that would prove invaluable in court. "As a physician, I can testify that the assault was unprovoked and left visible trauma," she explained to investigators. The perpetrator showed no remorse and continued making discriminatory statements even after committing the crime. Richard Holbrook found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as investigators reviewed the passenger recordings that captured his enthusiastic support of Jessica's racist behavior. His attempts to distance himself from the situation were met with skeptical glances from federal agents who had already watched the evidence. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about my role in this situation," he stammered to Agent Chen. "I was simply trying to support the crew in maintaining order." But the recordings told a different story, capturing his racist comments and enthusiastic encouragement of discrimination. His corporate position at a major investment firm would soon be in jeopardy as the videos spread across social media. The Celestial Airways executives who boarded the plane looked like they were attending their own funeral. CEO William Sterling, CFO Patricia Williams, and Head of Operations Marcus Thompson knew they were facing a crisis that could destroy their company's reputation and trigger federal investigations into systematic discrimination. Sterling approached Amara with the careful deference of a man whose company's survival depended on her mercy. "Dr. Kingston, I want to personally apologize for this inexcusable incident. We're conducting an immediate review of all our policies and procedures." But Amara's response was calm and devastating. "Mr. Sterling, this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern of systematic discrimination that your company has either ignored or actively encouraged. We'll be discussing this extensively in the coming weeks." Jessica was led off the plane in handcuffs, her termination from Celestial Airways the least of her problems. Federal assault charges carried potential prison time, and the civil rights violations would likely result in significant financial penalties. Her racism had cost her everything: career, reputation, and freedom. As she was escorted past the passengers she had abused, Jessica made one final attempt to justify her behavior. "You'll see, when this all comes out in court, everyone will understand that I was just doing my job." The delusion was complete. Even facing federal charges, she couldn't acknowledge the reality of her discriminatory behavior or accept responsibility for her actions. Passengers began deplaning, many of them continuing to record and document the historic events they had witnessed. Moses Washington stopped to shake Amara's hand with tears in his eyes. "Your grandmother is looking down with pride right now," he said. "You've struck a blow for justice that will echo through generations." Carmen exchanged contact information with Amara, promising to testify in any legal proceedings and offering her medical expertise in documenting the ongoing effects of the assault. "This is going to change everything," she said confidently. "No airline will be able to ignore discrimination after this becomes public." As the cabin emptied, Agent Chen conducted preliminary interviews with key witnesses, while crime scene technicians photographed evidence and collected recordings from passenger phones. The FBI was treating this as a serious federal crime with potential civil rights implications. The airline executives huddled in intense conversation, their voices low but their panic evident. Stock prices would plummet when the story broke. Federal investigators would examine their hiring and training practices, and congressional hearings were almost certain. Patricia Williams, the CFO, reviewed financial projections on her tablet with growing alarm. "If we face federal sanctions and civil rights lawsuits, we could be looking at bankruptcy within 6 months." Marcus Thompson, head of operations, was already fielding calls from other Celestial Airways employees who had witnessed or participated in discriminatory behavior. "We've got dozens of staff members calling in, either offering to testify against Jessica or worried about their own exposure." The scope of the problem was becoming clear. Jessica Whitmore wasn't a rogue employee, but a symptom of a diseased corporate culture that had tolerated and encouraged discrimination for years. Now the question that everyone's asking. Comment number 1 if you think Jessica deserves prison time for her assault and discrimination, or comment number 2 if you think she's just a product of a corrupt system. Smash that like button if you're feeling the same satisfaction that Moses and Carmen are right now, and make sure you're subscribed because what happens next is going to transform an entire industry. But here's what I want to know. How do you think Dr. Amara Kingston is going to use her power as the airline's owner? Will she show mercy to the executives who enabled this behavior, or is she going to clean house completely? The answer is coming up, and it's more dramatic than you could possibly imagine. As federal agents completed their preliminary investigation and executives faced the reality of their company's crisis, Dr. Amara Kingston sat quietly in the empty cabin, planning the transformation of an entire industry. Her grandmother's dream of equality in transportation was about to become reality, but first, there would be a reckoning unlike anything the aviation world had ever seen. The plane was empty now except for investigators and executives, but the real drama was just beginning. Jessica Whitmore's racist assault had opened Pandora's box, revealing decades of systematic discrimination that would soon face the full force of federal justice and corporate accountability. The flight was over, but the journey toward equality was just beginning. The Celestial Airways corporate headquarters at LAX resembled a war room 24 hours after the assault incident. Emergency meetings had been called, crisis management consultants summoned, and legal teams assembled as the company faced the most serious challenge in its 40-year history. CEO William Sterling stood before a conference room filled with executives, lawyers, and public relations specialists, watching in horror as news coverage of the incident dominated every major network. The passenger recordings had gone viral, accumulating over 50 million views and triggering a firestorm of outrage that was rapidly expanding beyond social media. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling said, his voice hollow with exhaustion, "we are facing an existential crisis. Dr. Amara Kingston, who owns 60% of our company, was systematically abused and assaulted by our employee. The federal investigation has begun, and our stock price has dropped 30% in overnight trading." Patricia Williams, the CFO, pulled up financial projections that painted a grim picture. "We're facing potential lawsuits from Dr. Kingston, other passengers who witnessed discrimination, and possibly hundreds of former passengers who experienced similar treatment. Conservative estimates put our liability at over $200 million. But the financial damage was only the beginning." Marcus Thompson, head of operations, had spent the morning fielding calls from Celestial Airways employees who were either coming forward with their own stories of encouraged discrimination or desperately trying to distance themselves from the company's toxic culture. "We've identified at least 12 other incidents involving Jessica Whitmore that were reported to supervisors and ignored," Thompson reported grimly. "And she's not alone. Our preliminary internal investigation suggests this kind of discriminatory behavior was widespread and systematically covered up." The conference room door opened to admit the company's head of legal affairs, Margaret Chen, whose face was pale with the gravity of the situation they faced. She carried a thick folder of documents that would reshape the company's future. "I've just finished reviewing Dr. Kingston's inheritance documentation," she announced. "Not only does she own controlling interest in our airline, but her grandmother's estate includes detailed records of discriminatory incidents dating back 15 years. They've been building a case against us for over a decade." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Evelyn Kingston hadn't just inherited stock in the airline, she had been systematically documenting discrimination as evidence for exactly this kind of reckoning. Sterling's phone buzzed with an urgent message that made his face go white. "Dr. Kingston's legal team has requested a meeting today at 2 p.m. They're not asking, they're demanding." As if summoned by his words, the conference room's main screen flickered to life with an incoming video call. Dr. Amara Kingston appeared on the monitor, seated in what was clearly a law office surrounded by an impressive array of legal professionals. "Mr. Sterling," she said without preamble, "I think we need to discuss the future of Celestial Airways." The executives scrambled to look professional, but their panic was evident to everyone watching. Sterling cleared his throat nervously. "Dr. Kingston, we want to assure you that yesterday's incident was completely aberrant behavior that doesn't represent our company values." Amara's response was devastating in its calm precision. "Mr. Sterling, I have documentation of 47 separate incidents of racial discrimination by Celestial Airways employees over the past 15 years. Jessica Whitmore's assault was not aberrant. It was the inevitable result of a corporate culture that encourages prejudice." She gestured to one of her lawyers, who began reading from a thick file. "Incident 23. March 2019, Flight 892. Passenger Maria Santos was told the business class bathroom was temporarily out of order, while white passengers used it freely." Incident 31. August 2020. Passenger David Chen was questioned about the authenticity of his first-class ticket for over 20 minutes, while his white seat neighbor was served champagne. The list continued for several minutes. Each incident, documented with dates, flight numbers, and witness statements. The pattern was undeniable. Celestial Airways had been systematically discriminating against passengers of color for years. Patricia Williams looked like she was going to be sick. "Dr. Kingston, we had no knowledge of this pattern. If we had known—" "You did know," Amara interrupted. "My grandmother's law firm sent complaint letters about many of these incidents. Your legal department responded with form letters dismissing the concerns and denying any wrongdoing. Margaret Chen rifled through old files and found exactly what Amara was describing. A pattern of complaint letters from Evelyn Kingston's law firm and dismissive responses from Celestial Airways' legal team. "My God," she whispered. "We've been covering this up for years." The scope of the company's liability was becoming clear, and it was far worse than anyone had imagined. This wasn't about one rogue employee. It was about a systematic pattern of discrimination that reached the highest levels of corporate leadership. Sterling made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Dr. Kingston, what can we do to make this right? We're willing to implement any changes you deem necessary." Amara's response was swift and uncompromising. "Every member of the current executive team will resign immediately. We're implementing a zero-tolerance discrimination policy with independent oversight, and we're establishing a $50 million victim compensation fund for passengers who experience discrimination." The demands were breathtaking in their scope. Essentially, Amara was gutting the entire corporate leadership and rebuilding the company from the ground up. Thompson tried to negotiate. "Dr. Kingston, surely we can work together to implement gradual changes without destroying the careers of executives who weren't directly involved." "Mr. Thompson," Amara cut him off, "you personally signed off on Jessica Whitmore's performance reviews for 3 years, giving her excellent ratings despite multiple discrimination complaints. You weren't uninvolved. You were complicit." The accusation was devastating because it was true. Thompson's own signature was on documents praising Jessica's professional standards and ability to maintain appropriate passenger behavior. Williams made one final attempt to preserve her position. "Dr. Kingston, as CFO, I was focused on financial operations, not passenger service issues. Ms. Williams, you approved the legal budget that paid for attorneys to dismiss discrimination complaints without investigation. You funded the cover-up." One by one, Amara systematically demolished every executive's attempt to claim ignorance or avoid responsibility. Her grandmother's meticulous documentation had created an airtight case that exposed the entire corporate structure as complicit in systematic discrimination. Sterling realized his career was over and decided to go down with dignity rather than denial. "Dr. Kingston, you're right. We failed in our most basic obligation to treat passengers with dignity and respect. I'll submit my resignation today." The other executives followed suit, understanding that their positions were untenable given the evidence against them. But Amara wasn't finished. There will also be a complete audit of hiring practices, mandatory bias training for all employees, and partnership with civil rights organizations to ensure accountability. As the video call ended, the conference room sat in stunned silence. In less than 24 hours, a single incident of racist violence had exposed and destroyed a corporate culture built on discrimination and prejudice. The transformation of Celestial Airways was about to begin. But first, there would be consequences for everyone who had participated in or enabled systematic discrimination. Jessica Whitmore's assault had opened the floodgates, and justice was finally coming to an industry that had hidden behind corporate policies and legal technicalities for far too long. Outside the headquarters, protesters were already gathering, with signs demanding justice for discrimination victims. Inside, executives were cleaning out their offices and lawyers were preparing for the biggest civil rights case in aviation history. Dr. Amara Kingston had inherited more than an airline. She had inherited the power to transform an entire industry's approach to equality and human dignity. The reckoning was far from over, but the foundation for justice had been laid at 30,000 feet by a woman who refused to accept discrimination as the price of flying while black. 6 months after Jessica Whitmore's assault aboard Flight 447, the transformation of Celestial Airways had become a case study taught in business schools across America. The company that had once embodied systematic discrimination was now leading the aviation industry in diversity, inclusion, and passenger rights. Dr. Amara Kingston stood in the renovated headquarters lobby, where portraits of civil rights leaders now hung alongside images of diverse employees and satisfied passengers. The old corporate culture had been completely dismantled and rebuilt from the foundation up. Jessica Whitmore herself had become a cautionary tale. After pleading guilty to federal assault charges and civil rights violations, she was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, 3 years of probation, and mandatory participation in diversity education programs. Her attempts to appeal the conviction had been laughed out of court, especially after additional victims came forward with their own stories of her discriminatory behavior. The former flight attendant now worked at a minimum wage job at a fast food restaurant, her aviation career permanently destroyed. Her assault conviction made her unemployable in any customer service role, and her racist behavior had been documented so thoroughly that employers routinely rejected her applications once they discovered her identity. Richard Holbrook had faced his own reckoning. The investment firm where he worked as a senior partner fired him within days of the viral videos surfacing, citing conduct incompatible with company values. His encouragement of Jessica's racism and his own recorded discriminatory comments had made him a liability no respectable company could afford to employ. Moses Washington, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity in the civil rights community. His dignified defense of Amara during the flight and his powerful testimony about discrimination had led to speaking engagements at universities and civil rights organizations across the country. Celestial Airways had hired him as a diversity consultant, and his granddaughter had received a full scholarship to medical school through the Kingston Foundation. Mr. Moses, as he was affectionately known throughout the company, had helped design the new employee training programs that made bias education mandatory for all staff. His folksy wisdom and lifetime of experience with discrimination provided real-world context that transformed how employees understood their responsibilities to passengers. Carmen Rodriguez had also found her life changed by the events of that night. Her medical documentation of Amara's assault had been crucial evidence in the federal prosecution, and her testimony about the psychological impact of discrimination had influenced new FAA regulations protecting passenger rights. She had been appointed to the Federal Aviation Consumer Protection Advisory Committee and was working on industry-wide reforms. The transformation of Celestial Airways went far beyond personnel changes. Amara had implemented revolutionary policies that other airlines were scrambling to match. Every employee now underwent extensive bias training, not just once, but annually. Customer service interactions were regularly audited by independent civil rights organizations. Passenger complaints about discrimination were investigated immediately by external firms. Most importantly, the company had established a zero-tolerance policy that was more than just words on paper. 3 employees had been terminated in the first month alone for discriminatory behavior, sending a clear message that the old culture was dead and buried. The financial results had been remarkable. Despite initial stock price drops and massive legal settlements, customer satisfaction had skyrocketed as word spread about the airline's transformation. Passengers who had previously avoided Celestial Airways because of its reputation for discrimination were now choosing it specifically because of its commitment to equality. The compensation fund for discrimination victims had paid out over $40 million to passengers who had experienced mistreatment over the years. Many recipients had been shocked to discover that their experiences were part of a documented pattern rather than isolated incidents. Federal investigators had expanded their probe beyond Celestial Airways to examine discrimination practices throughout the aviation industry. Congressional hearings had led to new legislation strengthening passenger protection laws and requiring airlines to report discrimination incidents to federal authorities. The Jesse Whitmore case, as it became known in legal circles, had established important precedents for civil rights enforcement in commercial aviation. Her conviction had emboldened other victims to come forward, leading to investigations at multiple airlines and an industry-wide reckoning with discriminatory practices. Dr. Amara Kingston had used her newfound platform to establish the Evelyn Kingston Institute for Transportation Equity, a research and advocacy organization dedicated to eliminating discrimination in all forms of public transportation. The Institute's work extended beyond aviation to buses, trains, and ride-sharing services, creating a comprehensive approach to transportation justice. The scholarship program Moses Washington's granddaughter had benefited from was just one part of a larger educational initiative. The Kingston Foundation was funding diversity programs at aviation schools, providing scholarships for underrepresented students, and supporting research into bias in transportation systems. Technology played a crucial role in the transformation. Amara's tech company had developed sophisticated monitoring systems that could detect patterns of discriminatory behavior before they escalated to the level of Jessica's assault. The software analyzed passenger complaints, employee interactions, and service patterns to identify potential problems early. Other airlines had initially resisted adopting similar measures, but public pressure and federal regulations were forcing industry-wide changes. Celestial Airways' success in rebuilding its reputation while maintaining profitability had proven that equality was good business as well as good ethics. The training programs developed for Celestial Airways had become a model for other companies facing discrimination issues. Moses Washington's storytelling approach, combined with Carmen Rodriguez's medical expertise in trauma and bias, created educational experiences that actually changed employee behavior rather than just checking compliance boxes. Jessica Whitmore's former colleagues had faced their own consequences. Several supervisors who had enabled her behavior were terminated, and others faced demotion or mandatory retraining. The message was clear. Discrimination would not be tolerated at any level of the organization. The cultural transformation extended to company hiring practices as well. Celestial Airways now actively recruited from historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic-serving institutions, and other diverse educational communities. The workforce that had once been predominantly white was becoming as diverse as the passengers it served. Customer feedback reflected the changes dramatically. Online reviews that had once complained about discriminatory treatment now praised the airline's commitment to dignity and respect. Social media mentions had shifted from negative to overwhelmingly positive as passengers shared stories of exceptional service, regardless of their race or background. The ripple effects extended beyond aviation. Other industries were examining their own practices in light of the Celestial Airways transformation, understanding that systematic discrimination was both legally dangerous and financially destructive in an increasingly diverse marketplace. Dr. Amara Kingston's leadership style had become a subject of study itself. Her combination of uncompromising principles and strategic thinking had achieved what many thought impossible: the complete cultural transformation of a large corporation in less than a year. As the 6-month anniversary of the assault approached, Amara reflected on how far they had come. Her grandmother's dream of equality in transportation was becoming reality, but the work was far from finished. The success of Celestial Airways was just the beginning of a larger movement toward justice in American business. The woman who had been slapped by a racist flight attendant had used that moment of injustice to transform an entire industry. It was exactly the kind of victory Evelyn Kingston had envisioned when she spent decades building the legal and financial foundation for this transformation. Justice had been delayed for far too long, but it was no longer denied. 1 year after the incident that shocked the aviation industry, Dr. Amara Kingston stood on the observation deck at Los Angeles International Airport, watching Celestial Airways planes taxi past, with their newly diverse crews visible through the cockpit windows. The transformation that had begun with a racist assault at 30,000 feet had reshaped not just one airline, but an entire industry's approach to equality and human dignity. The numbers told a remarkable story. Celestial Airways had gone from being one of the most discriminatory airlines in America to leading the industry in diversity metrics, customer satisfaction, and employee retention. More importantly, the changes had proven financially successful, with stock prices reaching all-time highs as passengers chose the airline specifically for its commitment to treating everyone with respect. Jessica Whitmore had been released from federal prison after serving her full sentence, her life forever changed by 18 months of consequences for her racist behavior. She now worked at a convenience store for minimum wage, her attempts to find better employment consistently thwarted by the permanent record of her assault conviction and the viral videos that would follow her forever. Her story had become a cautionary tale told in diversity training programs across multiple industries. The woman who had told Dr. Kingston to know her place had learned too late that place in modern America belonged to those who embraced equality rather than those who clung to prejudice. Richard Holbrook had similarly discovered that racism carried a permanent price. After losing his investment firm position, he had struggled to find work in finance, with potential employers citing cultural fit concerns when they discovered His role in encouraging Jessica's discriminatory behavior. His attempts to rebrand himself as a reformed advocate for diversity were met with skepticism from a public that had seen his true character revealed under pressure. Moses Washington had become one of the most respected voices in transportation, equality. Now in his 70s, he traveled the country sharing his wisdom about dignity, perseverance, and the power of standing up for what's right. His granddaughter had graduated medical school with highest honors and was completing her residency at one of the nation's top pediatric hospitals, her education funded by the scholarship program that had grown out of that transformative flight. "Young lady," he had told Amara during the anniversary celebration, "your grandmother would be so proud. You took one moment of injustice and turned it into a lifetime of change for millions of people." Carmen Rodriguez had leveraged her experience into a position as chief medical advisor for the newly established Federal Aviation Passenger Protection Office. Her expertise in documenting and treating the psychological effects of discrimination had influenced new regulations requiring airlines to provide mental health support for victims of discriminatory treatment. The Kingston Institute for Transportation Equity had expanded far beyond aviation. The organization now worked with bus systems, train companies, ride-sharing services, and even cruise lines to eliminate discrimination in all forms of travel. Their research had revealed systematic problems throughout the transportation industry, and their solutions were being implemented nationwide. Federal legislation known as the Evelyn Kingston Passenger Protection Act had been signed into law, creating strict penalties for transportation discrimination and establishing independent oversight boards to investigate complaints. The law was named for Amara's grandmother, whose decades of legal work and strategic planning had made the transformation possible. The act required all transportation companies to maintain detailed records of discrimination complaints, submit to regular civil rights audits, and provide mandatory bias training for employees. Most importantly, it established significant financial penalties that made discrimination expensive for companies that failed to protect passenger rights. Other airlines had been forced to follow Celestial Airways' lead or face federal intervention. 3 major carriers had paid substantial fines for discriminatory practices, discovered during investigations triggered by the Jessica Whitmore case. The industry-wide transformation had created a new standard where equality wasn't just morally right, but legally required and financially necessary. The technology solutions developed by Amara's company had been adopted by transportation systems worldwide. The bias detection software could identify patterns of discrimination before they escalated to assault, allowing companies to address problems through training and policy changes rather than criminal prosecution and public relations. Disasters. Training programs based on the Celestial Airways model were now mandatory throughout the aviation industry. Moses Washington's storytelling approach and Carmen Rodriguez's medical insights had created educational experiences that actually changed hearts and minds rather than just checking compliance boxes. The scholarship program had expanded to support over 5,000 students pursuing careers in transportation, hospitality, and customer service industries. The goal was to create a generation of professionals who understood that diversity and inclusion weren't just corporate buzzwords, but fundamental principles of American business success. International attention had been significant as well. Airlines in Europe, Asia, and South America had implemented similar reforms after studying the Celestial Airways transformation. The incident that began as an American scandal had become a global model for corporate accountability and social justice. Dr. Amara Kingston herself had been featured on the covers of Time, Fortune, and Newsweek magazines as one of the most influential business leaders in America. Her grandmother's strategic vision and her own technological expertise had created a blueprint for using corporate power to advance civil rights that was being studied and replicated worldwide. The personal cost had been significant, but worthwhile. Amara's face was now recognized internationally, making private travel difficult, but she had embraced her role as a public advocate for equality. Speaking engagements at universities, corporate conferences, and civil rights organizations had become a regular part of her schedule. The anniversary flight recreated the original route from Los Angeles to New York, but with a dramatically different experience. The diverse crew reflected the airline's transformation, with flight attendants from multiple ethnic backgrounds working together to provide exceptional service to passengers, regardless of their race, religion, or economic status. Captain Mitchell, who had witnessed the original incident, was now Director of Pilot Training for Diversity and Inclusion. His programs ensured that flight crews understood their role in creating welcoming environments for all passengers and knew how to intervene if discriminatory behavior occurred. As the anniversary flight reached cruising altitude, Amara reflected on her grandmother's prophetic words. Power reveals itself when least expected, and justice delayed is never justice denied when courage meets opportunity. The courage had come from passengers like Moses Washington and Carmen Rodriguez, who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. The opportunity had been created by Evelyn Kingston's strategic planning and Amara's own position as owner of the airline. Together, they had turned a moment of racist violence into a transformation that would benefit generations of travelers. The flight attendant who served Amara's water did so with genuine warmth and professionalism that would have been unimaginable under the old culture. The young woman, whose name tag read Maria, was participating in the airline's management training program and would soon become a supervisor herself. "Dr. Kingston," she said as she refilled Amara's glass, "I just wanted to thank you because of what you did. My little sister believes she can be anything she wants when she grows up. You showed us that standing up for what's right really can change the world." The words carried the weight of transformation that extended far beyond corporate policies or federal legislation. A generation of young people had witnessed justice triumph over prejudice, and they were growing up with different expectations about equality and dignity. As the plane began its descent into New York, Amara looked out at the city lights below and thought about all the passengers who would fly safely and respectfully because of the changes that had begun with one flight. Attendant's terrible mistake. Jessica Whitmore's assault had inadvertently triggered the most significant advancement in transportation civil rights since the desegregation of public buses. The video screens throughout the cabin displayed a message that had become standard on all Celestial Airways flights. "We are committed to treating every passenger with dignity and respect, regardless of race, religion, or background. Discrimination has no place in our skies." But the real legacy wasn't in corporate messaging or policy documents. It was in the thousands of employees who had learned to see beyond skin color to human dignity. It was in the passengers who flew without fear of discrimination. It was in the children who grew up believing that equality was normal rather than revolutionary. Moses Washington dozed peacefully in his seat, dreaming of his late wife who had faced similar discrimination as a nurse in the 1960s. She would have been amazed to see how far the country had come, how one woman's courage had transformed an industry and inspired a movement. Carmen Rodriguez reviewed medical journals on her tablet, her expertise in bias and trauma now recognized internationally. The research she had conducted on the psychological effects of discrimination had influenced healthcare policies far beyond aviation, creating better support systems for victims of prejudice in all settings. As the wheels touched down at JFK, passengers throughout the cabin felt something that had been missing from air travel for too long: the confidence that they would be treated with dignity regardless of who they were or what they looked like. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. Dr. Amara Kingston had inherited more than an airline. She had inherited the responsibility to use power for justice. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory as the plane taxied to the gate. Power reveals itself when least expected, and justice delayed is never justice denied when courage meets opportunity. Tonight, courage had met opportunity at 30,000 feet, and the sky would never be the same. Now I want to hear from you. Comment number 1. If you believe this story shows that individual actions can create systemic change, or comment number 2. If you think it takes more than one person to transform an industry. Smash that like button if this story inspired you to stand up against discrimination in your own life. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of justice and transformation. But here's my question for you. What would you have done if you were a passenger on that flight? Would you have had the courage to speak up like Moses Washington and Carmen Rodriguez? Or would you have stayed silent like so many others? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember to hit that share button because stories like this need to be heard. In a world where discrimination still exists, we need reminders that justice is possible, when good people refuse to stay silent. Thank you for watching this incredible journey from prejudice to justice, from one woman's pain to an entire industry's transformation. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight, and remember that your voice matters more than you know. Stay strong, stay hopeful, and never forget that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a single act of courage at 30,000 feet. This remarkable story teaches us several profound lessons about power, justice, and human dignity. First, discrimination often thrives in environments where people remain silent. Moses Washington and Carmen Rodriguez showed us that speaking up against injustice requires courage, but it's essential for creating change. Their willingness to defend a stranger transformed a moment of abuse into a catalyst for transformation. Second, assumptions about people based on appearance can lead to devastating consequences. Jessica's racist prejudices blinded her to Amara's true identity and power, ultimately destroying her own career. We must judge people by their character and actions, not their race or clothing. Third, systematic change requires both individual courage and institutional power. Amara's response wasn't just personal revenge. She used her position to create policies that would protect future passengers from discrimination. Real justice means preventing others from experiencing the same harm. Fourth, accountability matters at every level. The executives who enabled Jessica's behavior faced consequences because discrimination is never just about one person. It's about systems that allow prejudice to flourish unchecked. Finally, this story proves that justice, though sometimes delayed, can triumph when courageous people refuse to accept inequality as normal. Every passenger who flies safely today benefits from one woman's decision to transform her pain into purpose. What moments of discrimination have you witnessed in your own life? Comment below and tell us. Would you have had the courage to speak up like Moses and Carmen, or would fear have kept you silent? Your honesty matters because it helps us all grow. If this story moved you to think differently about standing up against injustice, smash that like button and let us know. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our powerful stories of transformation and hope. These stories need to reach everyone who believes in equality and justice. Share this video with friends and family who need to hear that change is possible when good people refuse to stay quiet. Tag someone who inspires you to be braver in the face of discrimination. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey from prejudice to justice. Your engagement helps these important stories reach the people who need them most. Until next time, remember that your voice has power, your courage matters, and together we can create a world where dignity and respect aren't privileges, but rights that belong to everyone. Keep fighting for justice, keep believing in change, and never forget that sometimes the most important battles are won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things.